Hi, everyone. Welcome to Listening to Lancaster. I'm Diana Martin with Hourglass, and it's my pleasure to be joined by Cody Kiefer today, the urban forester for the City of Lancaster. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Diana.
I'd also like to thank the sponsors of these episodes, Lap Electric, Landis Communities, and Martin Insurance for their support. So let's jump right in. Cody, let's start with your job. I don't know how many people are familiar with an urban forester. What is an urban forester and what does kind of a normal day at work look like for you?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great beginning to the interview here because as I've shared my position since moving here, I get a lot of quizzical, puzzle stares and just general, lack of ability to engage in the relationship between urban and forest. But yeah, so I'm the urban forester. I'm looking at things from the forest level scale. So I think a lot of us would be familiar with what an arborist does. So an arborist is concerned with the care of individual trees. They'll look at a tree, they'll make decisions about that tree, then they'll move on to the next one and not necessarily think about the relationship between the two trees. So, for a municipality like the City of Lancaster, we definitely want to think beyond that because we want to know where things like tree loss are happening. So we can lose the forest for the trees, for instance, by just looking at individual trees and not notice that an entire community is starting to see a lot of tree loss, for instance. And so, at my position, I'm looking at things certainly from a zoomed out perspective and scale. So my position is looking at things like what does the diversity of our urban tree population look like? There's a history from the early 20th century of massive American elm loss, which was kind of the ideal street tree in the early 1900s. And then we had Dutch elm disease come in and essentially wipe those out. We don't want to put ourselves again in a place where majority of our trees are lost. These trees that are essential infrastructure for our city. So I'm interested in species diversity, age diversity. We don't want a lot of our trees all dying at the same time. We're concerned when we do have other pests come in, like spotted lanternfly. What does that mean for our urban forest? And so, again, not looking at tree to tree scale because we have so many trees around, but instead looking at the bigger picture and trying to find balance for our city. So also starts to bring in other aspects of a unique urban ecology. So how are trees relating with the community? What does community outreach look like? How are we relating with development and other aspects that start building in a more complex view of the general greening of our city. And yeah, certainly a relatively unique position for a city of this size is to have the city arborist on staff, but now to bring on the urban forester piece as well. So by and large, this is a relatively the discipline itself has been around for a couple of decades, but the positions as urban foresters are relatively new, and Lancaster has jumped on that here at the beginning. And so we're hoping to see, curb the loss of our trees and start building in some more strategic plantings and greening initiatives.
So I think you mentioned you just started in this position, was it last year?
Correct.
For the city, and that was a new role for the City of Lancaster. So what really prompted the city to want to bring on an urban forester? What was the inspiration behind that?
Sure. I think, this having not been here, obviously, but kind of hearing the history of it, the city really was trying to compensate for the lack of a centralized position for these sorts of ideas and management, the kind of the programmatic creation. A lot of various staff members had kept it afloat for a while. So we were doing things like having an inventory of our street trees, but that was done in 2010 and hadn't really been updated. So, a lot of staff were trying to carry the weight of trees because we have, for the state of Pennsylvania especially, we have a pretty aggressive trees ordinance for the protection of our trees. We're light years ahead of where we would be normally, as far as not having a position like mine in place. We had a lot of passionate people who were concerned about the sustainability and resilience of the city. So I think it got to a point of where some job titles changed and responsibilities changed, and there was a recognition that there just needed to be a plan in place. And there's actually one of our planners that set out to develop the Trees for People action plan and determine what are the city's values as far as our trees are concerned. I think we loosely understood it at the time, but can we cement them? Can we codify our values around trees and then have the mayor and city council start to sign off on this and have some cohesive philosophy around where we stand? And so as part of that process of developing the Trees for People action plan, not only did we codify some of our values and recognize where we were, as far as, a city of trees, that we have so many trees, that we need so many trees to meet our goals, those sorts of things. But there was a very helpful prioritization matrix that was developed in that plan as well. And so the first priority was to create this position, and then this position would be the one to continue to enact that Trees for People action plan and grow it further. So there was loose awareness of the necessity of some protector of the trees, the Lorax, if you will, to oversee the trees here. And then it was just a matter of finally getting that plan in place. And the city's doing a great job right now of actually trying to develop strategic plans and a series of aspects like our active travel, and modes of travel and that sort of thing in the city as well. And that just helps us for many things like planning, but also funding and just knowing where we are as a city. And to know where competing interests lie, and where also most especially where that sort of symbiosis can exist between multiple plan sets. So our green infrastructure plan and our trees plan, they interact closely. Our active transportation plan and our trees plan actually operate closely, because you can imagine the benefits of shade and other aspects of highly travelable areas of the city are beneficial for like our biking program and that sort of thing as well. So yeah, born out of a plan, and which is great as I develop the new programming that I can look back and see where we've already identified that we need to be and where we have been.
So your official title is urban forester, unofficial title is the Lorax of Lancaster.
That's right. Most often I'm called the tree guy, so he's just the tree guy, and so I'll answer to whatever whistle I get, I suppose.
Well, I'd love to talk a little bit more about the Trees for People action plan. But before that, I'm curious a little bit about your background. What brought you to Lancaster, and how did you get involved in this work of urban forestry?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, my background is varied. So it's certainly not a direct A to B sort of trajectory that got me here. My initial professional ambition was to be a veterinarian. During my pre-vet studies, I did take a couple of plant classes. A plant ecology class especially was my favorite class of my undergraduate studies. Really starting to think, as my mind does, about all the connections amongst us. And so definitely ecology is where, the science that I really leaned into. And so doing some interesting, unique studies there, some systematic botany sort of classes, led me eventually to decide to get a master's in horticulture rather than, a veterinary degree. And so from there, I just loosely bounced around until I found, exactly where I love to be. And trees have always been it. So trees have always provided a sense of place for me. They've always provided some, means of recreation for me. I grew up in the Southeast, which is heavily forested. And so I was always climbing trees and doing all the things that, a rambunctious kid in the 90s would do. And so, that eventually led to bouncing around and utilizing that master's degree in the plant-based education in international ag development. So I worked loosely, with people from all around the world to try and build out some sustainable food production systems, and education around those. That's can go down a tangent for another place, but eventually I realized that I wanted to go back to school and really hammer in around the urban forestry piece. And that was largely built around the idea that I felt very fortunate to find a love for trees and to have grown up in a rural setting where, I had freedom to do a lot of things and explore a lot of places and see a lot of just general beauty. But that's not necessarily the case for, a lot of people, and especially in inner city areas that don't necessarily have the same resources or opportunities. So I had the desire to then take the nature to them. And so I did pursue some more graduate studies in urban forestry in Virginia. And that's eventually led here to, my special interest was especially in stormwater management with trees. And so the city being, under the consent decree, definitely an advantage to getting this position.
Well, we're glad to have you in Lancaster. I hope that you like it here so far. So you mentioned that, urban forestry is kind of a relatively new discipline, especially for smaller cities like Lancaster. Is there a model city for urban forestry? Are there other communities that you kind of look towards with the work that we're doing here?
Certainly there are. I mean, you'll find articles if you were to do enough internet searches about the top 10 cities, for urban forestry. Of course, New York City is there, Charlotte, North Carolina is there, and several others. The problem with using them as models is kind of multiple in the issues. One being that Pennsylvania is a relatively unique state. If you go to places like Charlotte, North Carolina, the ownership of the street trees is far different than what we have here. Where in Pennsylvania, in a third-class city like Lancaster City, the abutting property owner is responsible for the street tree, and that adds some interesting variables, we'll say, for how we manage our street trees, and how we plan for them. So I mean, in the state of Pennsylvania, actually Lancaster City has been a great model for the rest of the state, and I stepped into this position not knowing that. In multiple meetings and interviews that I've had, a lot of people are looking at Lancaster City already, so the spotlight's already on us. I mean, Philadelphia is doing a great job. Philadelphia is a first-class city, so there are even differences there about how they're able to generate revenue to support their tree planting programs and that sort of thing. But yeah, I definitely look at Philadelphia, since they are somewhat constrained by similar state issues, and they're very close. But also Pittsburgh. But of course, Pittsburgh is also has a really great nonprofit supporting their tree ventures as well. So yeah, it's difficult to say. I mean, Pittsburgh is far more like DC, and DC has KC Trees, that is a nonprofit that's developed around the urban tree canopy. But yeah, Philadelphia is certainly what I do look at, especially for them right now, is how they've been able to reach into communities that have otherwise been tree blind or have not placed values and neighborhood identity around trees, how they've been able to implement strategic and iterative initiatives for building in some community pride. And yeah, they've done some planter work in formerly redlined communities that is certainly on my, the forefront of my desk and my workload here to figure out how we can do it in our city as well.
That's great. So you mentioned a little bit earlier about the Trees for People action plan that was adopted by Lancaster City in 2020. I'll actually link to the plan for people who want to check it out in more detail, but I was curious if you could just maybe give us a high level overview of what that plan says.
Sure. Yeah. So the plan undertakes a few things. It really outlines kind of the state of the art, is a phrase to use, the state of the art of our urban forest as of 2020. And, that the time of writing was closer to like 2017 to 2020. So some of the data definitely became outdated by the time it was formally established. But yeah, like I said, it really tries to establish city level philosophies and stances around our urban forests. So it definitely says that we do care about our trees, and tree loss is a significant loss to the city. So yeah, the plan outlines, that equitable distribution of such a resource is highly important to the city, and then starts to identify where the unknowns are. So while we know that trees are important, we've been a Tree City USA, that's a designation, a Tree City USA community. That's a designation provided from the Arbor Day Foundation. We are one of the longest standing cities in Pennsylvania, and yeah, even on the East Coast here, of having, I think we had our 45th year as a Tree City USA last year. That's important, and that yeah, we want that to continue on, but we also want to grow our urban forest as well. So the unknowns around what that should look like were not identified in this plan yet. It's not a master plan. It's simply a Trees for People action plan. And then, it started to outline what we did know. So we had an inventory done. Last street tree inventory was done in 2010. So it started to look at that and what it meant, which was that, yeah, we got some funding figured out around what it would mean to actually support the urban forest as of the 2010 inventory. Something like $500,000 a year would be required in order to manage all the street trees. Yeah, it starts to dip into all those different areas. But as I mentioned, possibly the most important piece, especially for me as I stepped into this, was the prioritization matrix, and really saying that, number one was figuring out what this position is. Number two is to figure out what the new baselines are. So because of that plan, I was able to take on two, significant initiatives this past year, which included an updated street tree inventory, which included, contractors coming out and touching all of 12,300 trees. And then, yeah, doing an urban tree canopy analysis as well. So kind of similar to the distinctive between the arborist and the urban forester. The inventory would be that tree by tree assessment. So we know whether a tree it has a significant risk associated with it because it's dying and may fall on a car or a property in some way. And we know what to do with that now. Versus the urban tree canopy analysis, which is looking at, things from a broader level and, what is that exact cover in our city and how's that cover distributed. And then both of them kind of get at, the ideas around ecosystem service evaluation. So ecosystem services being those things that the trees do for us. And so happy to talk about that if you'd like to. But yeah, significant values associated with our trees from both of those assessments. And so then those will start to snowball into the larger pieces like developing a master plan, and like trying to build in some additional programming to support our property owners, since they are the ones responsible for the street trees. What can the city do to actually stand alongside them? As we say that the trees are important, we need to put our money where our mouth is. And in this case, that's where we're moving towards as well.
So you mentioned you've been working on kind of updating that inventory of the city's trees. Is 12,300 trees, is that just street trees? So not even trees in people's backyards?
Yeah, so really the 12,300 gets at a few things. So that is every existing tree in the public sphere. So public spaces being the right of way and parks, which are also right of way. So 12,300 also encompasses things like tree wells, where there is not currently a tree, but there will be a tree. So definitely needed to know where there are immediate opportunities for replacing trees, and then also what the other conditions are.
So what did you find in that inventory? How does our tree population look as far as, diversity, equitability around the city, even kind of species, age? You mentioned those are some of the characteristics you're looking at.
Right. Yeah. So the inventory is far less fun to talk about in these sorts of levels, but I'll give it a stab here. And so we do have around 12,300 inventoried sites. Out of those, we have about 11,500 trees. And again, these are within public rights of way. So that is between curb and sidewalk, or just on the other side of the sidewalk and overhanging the right of way. And then those that are in parks. And so of those 11,500 trees, if we back out, I did find important things like we have about 118 dead trees just standing around the city right now. That gives me pause because I want to get those out of there as soon as possible, and we can talk about how we're moving forward if you'd like on that. But around 118 dead trees that need to get out of our public spaces. We have more poor trees that need to be removed, those that are declining and will be dead in the next couple of years that we need to proactively remove so that they don't get into some particularly hazardous place. And so those are the big takeaways as far as that's concerned. But the ecosystem services are where we can kind of drill into a little bit, because this is where I think people definitely have pause, and rightly so, around things like, the trees possibly lifting sidewalks and destroying properties and being a risk, and they are messy and that sort of thing. But where that should be balanced with is around the ecosystem service provisions. So there's a model called I Treat Eco that the U.S. Forest Service developed with some partners. And so we've been able to attribute, direct dollar values to the services that these trees provide. First, just a general valuation of the trees, like what is our, the 11,500 trees, what are they worth to the city if we could sell them on the market, let's say. It's $40 million, right at $40 million of infrastructure that the city has in our trees that, has that, level of dollar value. And that's nothing to sneeze at. That's a significant infrastructure, valuation in the city here. But the services, and we'll talk about annual services, these are things like shade provision. So that shade provision means that you have less cooling that needs to be done on your property, that sort of thing. Property value increases with the addition of trees. CO2 reductions and oxygen increases, and all these other ecosystem services that the trees provide. We on an annual basis, the trees provide a further $1.5 million thereabout of these services, and that's at the 11,500. So that obviously increases. Trees get bigger, but also as we plant more. So it's certainly a win-win situation for the city to continue to invest in our urban forests.
You mentioned earlier that the consent decree that we have in Lancaster City, and that, the trees, one of their ecosystem services is to help with storm water and as a part of our green infrastructure plan. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how you're thinking about trees in relation to those issues?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of where the nexus of science is happening right now in urban forestry, at least, right? So we already have some models, like the valuation models that we just spoke about. Part of my graduate research was really trying to look at how to build out more useful models for how trees interact with stormwater. So trees are essentially like sponges. We've all stood beneath a tree when it starts to rain. I mean, they don't just shed water. They actually, all the surfaces of the tree will be coated before you start to really see a lot of water, reach down from the canopy to ground level beneath the tree. So when you consider that, and you consider that street trees especially are overhanging our roads and our sidewalks, then that's gallons of water per tree that are reduced and don't go into our sewer system, which can overflow depending on the event into our waterways and then eventually into the Chesapeake Bay and pollute it. So it is a significant contributor to the stormwater management for the city. So it's a recognized BMP, or best management practice, in our green infrastructure design manual, and people can start to utilize it for offsetting some of the impervious area that they install at their property. So trees are integral for that, and it's important not just because they provide those stormwater benefits, but they provide so many more in conjunction. So it is a multifaceted sort of benefit with each and every tree that's provided. But certainly the greatest services that it provides is when the tree is overhanging impervious area. And just to define that, impervious area meaning that water cannot penetrate. So in a typical forested area, water just soaks into the ground, goes into a water table, and then either flows from there or gets taken back up. But in a city like this, it's essentially a concrete jungle. So the water has to flow somewhere since it can't infiltrate. And often that's into our storm drains. And so the trees can help offset that significantly. And there are actually some systems being developed right now that will intentionally direct stormwater into tree systems for the trees to further, do things like transpire that water, suck it up from its roots, and send it back off into the atmosphere through its leaves. But that's kind of in the next few years, we'll hopefully start implementing some of that in Lancaster City as well.
Yeah, I think that's you've mentioned a number of benefits that come from our street trees. It's, shade and helping to raise our property values, and they're beautiful and help with stormwater issues. But the flip side of that, you also mentioned that there's some challenges. And one of the challenges is that like you said, property owners are responsible for those trees. And I live in the city, so I also hear the concerns around, a tree breaks a pipe or a sidewalk comes up. How are you thinking about some of that? You said community outreach is kind of one of your priorities. How are you thinking about that community outreach and working with homeowners as we grow our urban forestry program?
Sure. I mean, I think this is often one of the downsides to the marketing around urban forests and tree planting in cities is that we often talk about the benefits but never talk about the disservices, right? So we have the ecosystem services. We also do have disservices that are provided, especially as we have just competing land uses in the city. And so that's a regular part of my day-to-day work here is to figure out and work with our engineering team about any sidewalk conflicts or other things that are happening. So it's certainly a concern, and so my first step is always just to listen to the property owner. So there are reasonable concerns to be had with each tree that exists. So you may have a upheaved sidewalk. You will definitely have some form of debris. So leaves are falling right now. So what do you do with that? Some people definitely don't like that, or fruit that falls, or squirrels that live in your tree. There are numerous concerns that people have, and it's just really about trying to put those into perspective. So one being that trees aren't just ready to fall down at any given moment if it's a healthy tree. So this type of risk aversion is something that I'm regularly having conversations about. We don't like these sorts of conversations, but it's far riskier to drive in a car than it is a tree is going to fall on you or your house. So the education piece for that is certainly have an arborist or a qualified expert come out and do a regular appraisal of your tree every 2 to 5 years, depending on where you are, as far as your own economics, but also is your tree young or is it older? Is it starting to decline? And then, go based off of those. Just like we want to have good relationships with our doctors, with our electricians and plumbers, so that we have regular inspections of all the things that are important to us. We really do need to have that with our arborists as well. And so just like any of those other pieces, well, maybe not doctors, but plumbers and electricians, you start to have those regular relationships with them, your overall costs should decrease because you catch things ahead of time. It's that proactive piece that starts to build the sustainability that we need as far as the ownership of our properties. And so that piece of outreach is important, but also what are the city services and provisions that we can provide? And so definitely going out and sharing with people that I exist, that I am more than happy and willing to come and talk to you about your tree. I'm not the arborist. I'll provide an opinion to you, but ultimately, I would love for you to follow up with an arborist, but happy to tell you that right now I'm not concerned about your tree, or right now I am. Here's the permitting process, which has no cost associated with it. I can give you lists of contractors and arborists. We're starting to build in some more programming that I'm excited to announce in the next couple of years about how we can come alongside people similar to our sidewalk assistance program that we launched this year. We're hoping to mirror that with the tree assistance program. And I'm trying right now very explicitly to move us from a place of reaction where I get calls about trees falling to a place of proaction, where instead I'm anticipating that a tree will need to be removed because we don't want that risk, growing any more than it already exists for any particular tree. So, there's ample to be said and done. There's not a magic pill clearly, but just like any other investment or piece of our property, our dryers, they have to be replaced every so often. There are costs associated with the general maintenance of a tree, but it's not inexorable if we can get on, again, the proactive end and not the reactive end.
Does the city have some kind of budget for these initiatives as we think about expanding our urban forest here in Lancaster?
Yeah, right now, our budget's not increasing. It increased a couple years ago, but the reason it's not increasing is because we've been seeking alternate funding methods. So as I mentioned, that being a third-class city means that our revenue control is very limited. I believe our only means of revenue is real estate tax, which, when you start building a new programming, doesn't really help. We don't want to raise those. So really, one, we need the state to change some of its code, in relation to third-class cities. But we've started exploring other means. So, for instance, we were awarded, the urban forestry program was awarded $500,000 from the county ARPA funds this year in support of our urban forestry initiative. So that's going to go towards things like removing these, 118 dead standing trees around the city, and that will relieve those property owners from the potential of, anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000 of unexpected expense, and that sort of thing. So it'll also go towards tree planting initiatives to replace those, because it's never good to remove a tree without replacing, or you'll have net loss. And so, we're always looking for those sorts of opportunities. For tree planting, there are ample funding opportunities out there, especially in the Chesapeake Bay. It's the maintenance piece that we're trying to work on. And I've actually been involved in just very recently in trying to identify where funding streams can start coming into these sort of maintenance opportunities. We're looking at things like bond issuance. So we're receiving additional funds through that. That will allow for more urban forestry support. So then we can start, going into the poor trees that need to be removed and building out that tree assistance program as well, which, like I said, should follow suit from the sidewalk assistance program. So, we're additionally looking at things like, trying to get a water truck so that we can water trees on behalf of property owners, so that, establishment is happening. There are quite a few loose pieces that need to be tied up. And over the next 5 years, we've got funding to start addressing those and tying things up. So I'm going to look forward to providing some reports in 2027 that will be very promising for where we've gone.
What are some of your other goals for the future? Do you have a number in mind right now when you have those 12,300 sites inventoried? Do you have a number in the future that we're working towards, or will that be part of the master plan that you mentioned?
No, I mean, as the scientist that I am, I'm waiting on some data. So, that urban tree canopy analysis I'm waiting on, that will help us identify what our possible tree cover is. There have been some pretty aggressive strategies out there. There was a universal acceptance of 40% canopy cover. So essentially meaning that 40% of our city would be covered by trees in some way or another. We've since found out, since establishing that sort of universal goal, that a lot of cities don't even have the capacity to be covered by 40%. If you have a lot of high rises and things, for instance, it's just not going to happen. So we're waiting to establish some of that. I'm also just trying to, tossing around and try to figure out, I think, what is the best way to communicate strategies. Is it, for instance, trees per mile? Is it, trees per capita? Is it, trying to look at some of that? And a lot of that will also be driven by how our cover is distributed. So I'm very interested in knowing, are there some areas that are heavily covered, others that aren't? Undoubtedly, we do have that. And then, maybe establishing quadrant level sort of goals, or neighborhood level goals. So yeah, it's hard to say at this point because I'm waiting on data to come back in. I would love to throw out there, I want to double our tree numbers, but it may not be possible. And certainly right now, I think a lot of that impossibility would rest on reticence by property owners, that they just don't want to take on any risk at this point. So once we can begin to build some programming, I think our goals will shift over time as we start to build a hand in glove relationship with kind of the property owner responsibility.
Also, a lot of new development happening in Lancaster City right now. You mentioned that we have a pretty strong tree code or ordinance. How do you work with those developers, and what does that code say?
Yeah, so this is the fun part. This is my first municipal job. I've worked in nonprofit before this, so it's a new world to kind of have my eyes open to what things like development does actually look like. So I'll kind of explain the process a little bit for those that may not be aware. But yeah, so at the ideally at the point of conception of an idea for any particular land development, they'll begin to have conversations with our planning bureau here at the city, and we can start to talk through the various aspects of what requirements would be put upon that development, and then how they can meet them, and then also meet their needs as well. So we have things like, zoning that describes what land use can happen at that property, and other, engineering and stormwater needs that the property has to meet as well. So at that point, they'll begin to submit some designs to us, and we actually have a full, review process from a city team that does include myself and our arts manager and our right-of-way team that's looking at sidewalks and driveways and ADA access and street poles and light poles and those sorts of things. Our stormwater people are definitely wanting to make sure that developers are accounting for all of the additional stormwater stresses that are put on the city because of the development. So if they're not accounting for it, then our residents have to account for it. So we definitely want to make sure that they're doing their due diligence. So similarly, I look at the designs, and I have a couple things that I look at for any particular development. If there are existing trees on the lot, we want to make sure that preservation is prioritized as much as possible. So, a large tree provides significantly greater benefits than a small tree. So just replacing a tree doesn't do us much, because we lose decades of time that we can't speed up. That's the one thing we definitely can't control, is time. So preservation is an important aspect of plan review for development, and then tree planting as well. So developers are required to plant street trees at minimum. So they have to plant, for street frontage, so many trees per linear foot of street frontage. And then they also would have to replace trees if they do remove them from the interior of the site. So providing that oversight is, a full-time job at this point, especially with some of these that are starting to, develop in some of the outskirts of town where we do have significantly wooded areas. We have to make some complicated decisions, certainly. And then, we do have a shade tree commission. We've not spoken about that, but our shade tree commission is established by the mayor's office and city council. And then they also provide oversight of what street trees are going into our right of way as well. So we want to prioritize largest species appropriate for the site, and then make sure that they're also meeting diversity initiatives and those sorts of things as well.
Well, we've learned a lot in this interview. For people who are listening, who are maybe just passionate about getting more developing our urban forestry initiatives in Lancaster City. Are there ways for them to either get involved or learn more about your work?
Sure. I mean, yeah, always looking for neighborhood and community leaders. I mean, at this point, it's tedious to try and convince each and every person from my office alone. So where we're trying to move is to identify who are those, real, Loraxes themselves, those people who would be willing and able to canvas and to build some sort of block level or neighborhood level support around tree planting initiatives. um, I want to start to identify who those people are. I mean, there are plenty of people passionate about trees, and looking for opportunities. For things like planting, we also have opportunities as well. So I'm happy to add any individuals or groups to a tree stewards list that can help with things like riparian buffer plantings or street tree plantings as we move forward in the future with some volunteer efforts. We just planted last week around 100 trees in Longs Park. It's great to have those helping hands, and it certainly is establishing a legacy. So you plant a tree, and generations are going to benefit from it. So, but yeah, if anybody wants to reach out to me, I would be happy to talk to them about planting a singular tree at their property. We definitely need more street trees in the city. I'm happy to support any backyard initiatives as well. And then those leaders, and then also providing any opportunities for volunteers to get involved as well. So we're looking at some opportunities to officially recognize the people who start to contribute to this. And so please do reach out if you have any of those interests.
That's great. Is there anything I didn't ask about today, Cody, that you wanted to share?
I don't think so. I mean, I live at City Hall from Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. So just so you get to know that I do exist, and it is an exciting position, and we will see benefit over time. So this is a new program the city is excited about, and I'm excited to hear everybody who is excited about it. So we want to continue to push forward a urban forest for the city of Lancaster, and and definitely somehow build complete ownership from our residents as well. So the city's leading in kind of identifying this. We want to get people rallied around it as well, to recognize where Lancaster does exist. And in certain circles, I certainly am hearing, how everybody is looking towards us to be that example for where other cities can continue to manage their urban forest as well. So we're moving forward one tree at a time.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this Listening to Lancaster episode. And thanks for joining us here in Lancaster as our new urban forester here in the city of Lancaster. We'll be excited to kind of keep up with you over the next couple years as the plan develops and get some updates on how it's going. So for everyone who is watching, you can find more episodes of Listening to Lancaster on our YouTube channel or on our website at hourglasslancaster.org. Thanks for listening.